Welcome back to this series of videos we've been doing every now and then on books that I think more people should read. Honestly, these are books that may not crack the bestseller list, especially among Christians, especially among evangelical Christians, but nonetheless, they're books that have had an incredible and a profound impact on my own personal outlook, theology, worldview. They're just books that I wish more people had read. And so in this episode, we're going to be looking at Martin Buber's classic, A Land of Two Peoples. So as we jump into this, if you haven't already, we would really appreciate it if you would click that subscribe button. And when you do, hit the little notifications bell. That's how you know when we do things like live streams here on the channel where we give away study Bibles and other biblical resources. That's how you know when new videos come out. And it also just helps us out in the algorithm by telling YouTube, hey, there's an audience for this channel. So if you do that, greatly appreciated. But let's talk about A Land of Two Peoples by Martin Buber and why I think you should read it. It's no secret right now, things are not stable in the Middle East. The ongoing nightmare happening in Gaza, the horrendous events of October 7th, the decades of struggle and occupation and intifadas, failed peace agreements, assassinations of prime ministers. The Holy Land has been a place of unrest all of my life. Probably if you're watching this, all of your life too. And it's a powder keg rhetorically as well. Like I could make a video and say anything about Israel-Palestine and it'll be half loved, half hated. People are committed to their particular narrative when it comes to the Middle East. And I can't pretend to be objective. I can't pretend to be any different. What I can do is try to acknowledge my lack of objectivity and encourage everyone else to acknowledge theirs, and also try to seek out, listen to, and learn from voices who come from a different perspective than me. There are far too many preachers out there confidently proclaiming what Christians have to believe when it comes to especially modern day socio-geopolitical events in the Holy Land. But what's needed, what's always been needed, are people who are genuinely committed to peace, genuinely committed to reaching across divides, listening to those on the other side, and seeing them first and foremost as people created in God's image, and only then turn and address the different socio-political issues. Now, Buber was a professor, a sociologist professor at Hebrew University in Jerusalem in the early to mid 1900s. And this book is a collection of his writings. Some are letters, some are essays, some are involvements in public debate from 1918 to 1965. Now, Martin Buber was what's called a Zionist. Some people use that as a slur. I've even had people tell me, oh, that's like saying the N-word or something. No, Zionism is the name of a political national movement started in the late 1800s. It was founded as and became known as the World Zionist Congress. It's a neutral appellation, and there are shades of Zionism. And I was actually turned on to the writings of Martin Buber by reading an essay by a Zionist named Philip ben Shmuel talking about a type of Zionism known as Hagshama Zionism, or shared land Zionism. See, the type of Zionism that you hear about right now that's kind of spearheaded by Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, or historical figures like David Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, that type of Zionism says that the land of Israel is the homeland for the Jewish people exclusively. First and foremost, it's the Jewish people's land, and any other concerns come after that. Shared land Zionism, and the Zionism that Martin Buber and so many others advocate, says it is exactly what this book is titled, A Land of Two Peoples. So while, yes, the Holy Land is a land for the Jewish people to have as their homeland, it is also the homeland of another people. And so a lot of his writings, especially in this volume, deal with that question. What about the Palestinian, Arab, indigenous people in the land? It's their land as well. How are we to approach this entire concept of creating a safe haven homeland for our people, which Buber was, again, a Zionist? How do we do that in a way that not only is faithful to the religion of our people, Judaism, historically, but also recognizes and upholds the dignity of the people who have lived in this land for thousands of years as well, who aren't Jewish? That's what drew me into this when I first read Ben Shmuel citing it a couple of times in his essay, and I'm so glad I bought a copy, and I think more people should read this. Whatever your views on Israel-Palestine are, you should read this book. So let's look at a couple of excerpts that I found particularly impactful. This edition, I believe, was published around 2005. And here are some of the names of the essays or articles in it. February 1918, A State of Cannons, Flags, and Military Decorations. September 1921, Nationalism. September 1921, A Proposed Resolution on the Arab Question. April 1926, Soul Searching. February 1939, A Letter to Gandhi. August 1939, Concerning Our Politics. Spring 1940, False Prophets. March 1940, Let Us Avoid Provocations. April 1945, Politics and Morality. March 1946, The Meaning of Zionism. June 1947, Two Peoples in Palestine. 1947, The Binational Approach to Zionism. January 1948, Let Us Not Allow the Rabble to Rule Us. May 1948, Zionism and, quote, Zionism. March 1949, On the Moral Character of the State of Israel, a debate with David Ben-Gurion. March 1953, A Protest Against Expropriation of Arab Lands. January 1954, We Need the Arabs, They Need Us. October 1961, Letter to Ben-Gurion on the Arab Refugees. January 1962, Ben-Gurion and Israel's Arabs. January 1962, We Must Grant the Arabs Truly Equal Rights. And then the last one, February 1965, The Time to Try. Then there's some of the sources, there's an index, and then there's a note on his legacy at the end of the book. Now, one of the things I love about Martin Buber was he was not afraid to call out nationalism. This commitment to one's country, my country, right or wrong, that approach. Some people confuse it with patriotism. We have a video here on the channel where Captain America behind me on the shelf there explains the difference between patriotism and nationalism. And Buber did a great job of calling out Jewish nationalism. You know, we hear a lot about Christian nationalism in America, but in Israel, Christian nationalism isn't a thing. It's Jewish nationalism or Jewish supremacy. And that's always been a tension within world Judaism because not every Jewish person around the world is a nationalist when it comes to Israel. In fact, there are many anti-Zionist Jews all over the world, and some in Israel itself. So it's multifaceted. It's despite the slogans you hear from politicians and pundits, Israel and Judaism, nationalism and Judaism are not the same thing. And Martin Buber took pains to point that out all the way back in the 1920s. And he didn't mince words. He said, at certain moments in national life, a new phenomenon makes its appearance. We call it nationalism. Its function is to indicate disease. Bodily organs do not draw attention to themselves until they are attacked by disease. Similarly, nationalism is at bottom the awareness of some lack, some disease or ailment. A people is a phenomenon of life, a nation one of awareness, nationalism one of overemphasized awareness. And he says, original nationalism inspires the people to struggle for what it lacks to achieve this. But when nationalism transgresses its lawful limits, when it tries to do more than overcome a deficiency, it becomes guilty of what has been called hubris in the lives of historical personalities. It crosses the holy border and grows presumptuous. And now it no longer indicates disease, but is itself a grave and complicated disease. A people can win the rights for which it strove and yet fail to regain its health because nationalism, turned false, eats at its marrow. And he would go on to critique popular nationalism of his day and how he saw the Judaism that he knew, that he believed in, that he was all about being hijacked by political ideology, by geographical agendas, by a desire for earthly power. And so Buber warned his fellow Jews in Israel. He said to forget one's own peculiar character and accept the slogans and paroles of a nationalism that has nothing to do with the category of faith means national assimilation. In other words, there's always been a concern, especially within Judaism, of assimilation. This is why things like evangelism, proselytization, things like that have always been a concern for the Jewish people because of the fear of assimilating, becoming just like the other peoples. And Buber said, actually, nationalism is one of the biggest dangers of assimilation that we as Jews face. And again, this was back in the 1920s. This was before the state of Israel was established. He was saying these things. He says, if you boast of being chosen instead of living up to it, if you turn election into a static object instead of obeying it as a command, you will forfeit it. And then he goes on, in this way, we hope to save Jewish nationalism from the error of making an idol of the people. We have not succeeded. Jewish nationalism is largely concerned with being, quote, like unto all the nations. That's a biblical allusion. Affirming itself in the face of the world without affirming the world's reciprocal power. It too has frequently yielded to the delusion of regarding the horizon visible from one's own station as the whole sky. It too is guilty of offending against the words of that table of laws that has set up above all nations, that all sovereignty becomes false and vain when in the struggle for power it fails to remain subject to the sovereign of the world, who is the sovereign of my rival, and my enemy's sovereign as well as mine. It forgets to lift its gaze from the shoals of healthy egoism to the Lord who, quote, brought the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt and the Philistines from Caphtor and the Aram from Kir. Amos 9:7. Jewish nationalism bases its spurious ideology on a formal nationalistic theory, which in this critical hour should be called to account. So Buber was not afraid to speak truth to his own. And that's something that I've always appreciated, whether it's theological issues, whether it's political issues, whether it's ethical issues. When we're able to speak to our own side, to people like us, and say, hey guys, we're getting it wrong on this point, or to offer course correction, or sometimes to rebuke. I mean, I think that's what the prophets of Israel did. The prophets of Israel only occasionally called out the sins of other people. They did from time to time. Other nations received some prophetic rebuke, but it was rare in compared to how often the prophets in the Bible called out their own people. And in that regard, I think Buber absolutely is a prophetic voice from the 20th century. Another thing I appreciate about his work is his ability to step into the shoes of someone on the other side. He was a Zionist. He believed that the land of Israel was to be a safe homeland for the Jewish people. He was not anti-Zionist in that regard. However, he was also one of the loudest voices calling for, in the process of this establishing homeland, we have to look to the needs, to the desires, to the wants, to the dignity of the people who are already here. And unfortunately, Buber's vision of Zionism did not win out in the end. The Zionism of Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, and others since then is what won out. And that's part of, not the entire, but part of why things are the way they are today. But look at what Buber said. This is back in 1929. He said, every responsible relationship between an individual and his fellow begins through the power of a genuine imagination, as if we were the residents of Palestine and the others were the immigrants who were coming into the country in increasing numbers year by year, taking it away from us. How would we react to events? Only if we know this will it be possible to minimize the injustice we must do in order to survive and to live the life which we are not only entitled but obligated to live, since we live for the eternal mission, which has been embedded with us since our creation. Our relation with the Arabs ought to be developed positively in every respect. Economically, by developing a practical community of interests, and not, as we have done all the time, by giving assurances of an existing solidarity of interests. Everywhere and at all times when economic decisions have to be taken, the interest of the Arab people should be taken into account. This has not been done often enough. Everybody who knows the situation is aware of the many opportunities that have been missed. And this came from his foundational belief that what was going on in the Holy Land. Remember, this is in the 1920s. This is at the height of anti-Semitism throughout Europe and Jews immigrating into the Holy Land, finding safe haven from the rampant anti-Semitism around the world, particularly in Europe. And so look what Buber says. Something is being created here which is of unprecedented importance, an example for all mankind, marking out the path for it by trial and error, and even by missing the way from time to time. We thereby demand justice in the fullest sense of the word from humanity, provided it is aware of its real troubles and its genuine needs. We are now faced, however, with the added responsibility for that nation which has become our neighbor in Palestine, and which in so many respects shares a common fate with us. No contradiction could be greater if we continue to preserve the idea of our internal mission than for us to build a true communal life within our own community, while at the same time excluding the other inhabitants of the country from participation, even though their lives and hopes, like ours, are dependent upon the future of the country. So unlike many of the popular Zionist leaders at the time, Buber and others recognized this has to be done in a way that brings the peoples together. Ultimately, that didn't happen. And depending on which historical narrative you give more weight to, it was either the fault of the surrounding Arab nations or the Palestinian residents, or it was the fault of the Zionists and the colonial powers. Not even going to get into all that. Just from Buber's perspective, in the 1920s, he was crying out, this is the path that we need to be on. And he had a lot to say about this quest for power or for domination that he was seeing among many of his fellow Zionists. In June 1939, he wrote about our Pseudo Samsons. And this was about the militaristic spirit that he saw around him. He says, apparently there are young men in the Yeshuv, and that's what the Jewish community in the Holy Land was called before 1948 when Israel was founded. He says, apparently there are young men in the Yeshuv who fancy themselves to be contemporary Samsons. It seems they regard the placing of mines in the path of vehicles bearing innocent, defenseless non-Jews or attacking the homes of innocent, defenseless non-Jews as similar to Samson's exploits. They tell youths in the street that the time has come to act as Samson did. And if those youths want to be contemporary Samsons, all they have to do is learn from the speakers. It goes without saying that they find plenty of children who like listening to such things. How is this to be explained? When we returned to our land after many hundreds of years, we behaved as though the land were empty of inhabitants. No, even worse, as though the people we saw didn't affect us, as though we didn't have to deal with them. That is, as if they didn't see us. But they did see us. They saw us, not with the same clarity with which we would have seen them had we been the veteran denizens of the land and another people came to settle in it in ever-increasing numbers. Not with the same, but with sufficient clarity. Clarity that naturally only increased from year to year. We didn't pay any attention to this development. We didn't say to ourselves that there is only one way to forestall the results of this ever-increasing clarity of vision, to form a serious partnership with that people, to involve them earnestly in our building of the land, and to give them a share in our labor and in the fruits of our labor. We did not wish to believe those among us who sounded the warning. And then in 1946, just 2 years before the founding of Israel in 1948 and the War of Independence, he wrote an essay on the meaning of Zionism. And he said, independence of one's own must not be gained at the expense of another's independence. Jewish settlement must oust no Arab peasant. Jewish immigration must not cause the political status of the present inhabitants to deteriorate and must continue to ameliorate their economic condition. The tradition of justice is directed towards the future of this country as a whole, as well as towards the future of the Jewish people. He always saw the country, the Yeshuv, as a land of the whole, Jew and Arab. That's why the book is called A Land of Two Peoples. And again, he did believe in the vision of Zionism, that Israel was to be a safe haven for Jews facing unbelievable persecution, virulent anti-Semitism, the horrors of the Holocaust. All that was going on when he was writing this. But he also was clear about how it needed to happen in order to not continue the downward spiral of violence and evil and anti-Semitism and all the horrors that he had seen. And so he says, as to the demand for autonomy, it does not, and he's talking about Jewish autonomy, like the land being controlled exclusively by the Jewish people as the homeland for the Jewish people. He says, as to the demand for autonomy, it does not, as the greater part of the Jewish people thinks today, necessarily lead to the demand for a, quote, Jewish state or Jewish majority. And this was recently codified into modern Israeli law just a few years ago, by the way, that Israel is the exclusive state of the Jewish people. It's known as the national law. Back in the 40s, Buber was like, that's not the way. He said, we need for this land as many Jews as it is possible economically to absorb, but not in order to establish a majority against a minority. We need them because great, very great forces are required to do the unprecedented work. We need for this land a solid, vigorous, autonomous community, but not in order that it should give its name to a state. We need it because we want to raise Israel and Eretz Israel, and Eretz Israel just means the land of Israel in Hebrew, to the highest level of productivity they can be raised to. The new situation and the problem involved ask for new solutions that are beyond the capacity of the familiar political categories. He says, if a successful solution is found, a first step, perhaps a pioneer's step, will have been taken towards a juster form of life between people and people. And he means between Jewish people and Palestinian people. And then one of the most powerful essays, at least to me, was number 45. It's called Let Us Make an End to Falsities. And I won't read it because it's about 2 pages, but it was written October 1948. And it's his account of looking at and calling out the false myths that were being propagated in order to motivate the people to fight. He was lamenting the fact that what he had been advocating for decades had gone ignored, and people had done the opposite, and they had done it in his name, in the name of his people, in the name of the Jewish people, in the name of Judaism. And it was not a popular message. And in a lot of ways, Buber's writings remind me of Jeremiah in the Bible. Jeremiah was thrown into a well, into a cistern, put in prison because he spoke against the sins of his people. He dared to question the national narrative. He went against the grain of the nationalistic, warmongering, we can do it because God is on our side views that were prominent in Jeremiah's day. As long as the temple's standing, God's on our side. And he was persecuted because of it. Well, reading Martin Buber hits me that way. He was a voice writing against many of the popular sentiments at the time and many of the things today that are taken as just axiomatic truth regarding Israel, Judaism, Zionism. And so that's why I recommend this book so strongly. Not because you have to come away agreeing with Martin Buber. Now, cards on the table, I agree with his assessment for the most part. But I know that good, faithful people won't agree with him, and that's okay. The value is not so much in whether you agree with everything he says. The value is in listening to a voice, speaking to his own about the situation in which he was also a participant, someone swimming against the current. That's the value of Buber's A Land of Two Peoples. And then near the end of the book, we come to one of the final essays, We Must Grant the Arabs Truly Equal Rights. This was in 1962. And he says, the imperative of political wisdom is to contradict propaganda with facts. Unbridled suspicion is likely to strengthen what gives rise to suspicion and even create new reasons for it. It is true that blind faith causes damage both to individuals and to nations, but an open-eyed faith, a faith in the possibility of influencing someone else by one's own positive and constructive behavior, justifies itself more and more. The validation of this faith, however, is not instantaneous. Its efficaciousness will not be immediately evident to everybody. And he closes with this beautiful paragraph. Today, whoever considers war to be inevitable collaborates willingly or unwillingly, consciously or unconsciously in bringing about war. And he says, on the other hand, whoever refuses to believe that we cannot prevent the outbreak of war, that is to say, under today's technological conditions, which bring such widespread destruction and killing, such a person does his part to advance the cause of peace. And that's what Buber did through his essays and articles and thoughts in A Land of Two Peoples, is he bore testimony to the concept of peace, to humanizing those on the other side, to calling out power, to rejecting nationalistic temptations to be like the nations of this earth in favor of obedience and worship of the God of Israel. So even though Buber was not a Christian, we don't share the same theology in terms of recognizing the sovereign place of God over the political entities of the world. I found a kindred spirit in Martin Buber. And so for that reason, this is absolutely a book, especially now at this point in history, that every Christian who cares anything about not just the world, but particularly the people of the land, the Holy Land, Israel, Palestine, any of those things going on, this is a book that you need to have read as you sift through news stories and headlines and listen to politicians and pundits, as you scroll social media, as you hear pastors decreeing which nations need to be stood with. As you're sifting through all of that, this is a voice that needs to be in the conversation. And so for that reason, I absolutely put Martin Buber's A Land of Two Peoples in the category of books you need to read. That's all for now. Stay tuned for more. Again, these are just books that have shaped me. These are my candid and honest reflections. I'd love to hear from you. If you've read Buber's work, what do you think? Are there other works that you would recommend as well? Feel free to leave those in the comment section below. Thanks to those of you that have subscribed. If you haven't already, really appreciate you doing so. We'll see you back here next time at Disciple Dojo for more books you should read. In the meantime, as always, keep training.